The Arizona Territory was a land of sharp edges and no forgiveness. It carved lines into your face and stole the names of your loved ones from your lips. For Windy Hayes, a widow living on the high desert fringe, it had already taken everything. Or so she thought. She was a woman alone, with nothing but a dry well, a loaded rifle, and the ghost of her husband. But when a wounded boy collapsed on her land, an Apache boy, the son of the great Chief Victorio, she faced a choice. To save him was to invite her own death. To let him die was to lose her own soul. She chose to save him. She had 3 days. What happened next would become a legend, a story of fire, blood, and a debt paid in full. The silence of Hawk's Rest was a living thing. It was made of heat, distance, and the high, thin cry of the red-tailed hawks that gave the place its name. But for Windy Hayes, the silence was made of memory. It was the sound of the chair where her husband, Jonathan, no longer sat. It was the sound of the well, its bucket scraping against dry, cracked mud. Hawk's Rest wasn't a ranch. It was a homestead, a stubborn foothold on a high, wind-scoured mesa overlooking the Pinnacle Creek Valley. Jonathan had chosen it for the view, and for the deep, sweet water spring that gurgled from the rocks, a rare and priceless treasure in this parched land. He'd built the cabin with his own hands, the sturdy pine logs chinked tight against the relentless dust. Now, those same hands were dust themselves, buried under a simple wooden cross and a pile of stones near the lone cottonwood tree. It had been 6 months. 6 months since the raid. The folks in Pinnacle Creek, the small, sun-baked cluster of adobes and false fronts down in the valley, called it an Apache raid. Reverend Gideon, a man whose piety was as harsh as the landscape, had delivered a sermon thundering against the heathen vipers and the righteous fury of a vengeful God. Windy knew better. She had been in the root cellar when they came. She'd heard the hoofbeats, the shouts, the single, flat crack of the rifle shot. When she'd finally emerged, clutching her own Winchester, they were gone. Jonathan was lying near the porch, his eyes wide open to the unforgiving sun. The raiders had taken their 2 best horses and half a sack of flour, but they had left a clue. By the horse trough, clear in the damp earth, was a boot print. It was a U.S. cavalry boot, worn down at the heel, and the smell they'd left behind wasn't the wood smoke and buckskin of the Apache. It was the sour stench of cheap whiskey and unwashed men. She had told the marshal in Pinnacle Creek. He had looked at her with pity, his eyes sliding away. "Mom," he'd said, "Apache are known to steal cavalry boots. It's best you let this go. Best you sell this place and head back east where you belong." Windy belonged nowhere else. This land, which had taken everything, was all she had left. Her refusal to leave had made her an outcast. A woman alone was a problem the town didn't want to solve. Her quiet insistence that the raiders were white men was an accusation they didn't want to hear. It was easier to blame Victorio. Victorio. The name was a curse and a bogeyman for the entire territory. The chief of the Warm Springs Apache, a brilliant, brutal leader who had evaded the U.S. Army for years, his name was invoked to explain every missing cow, every spooked horse, every homestead failure. The true threat, however, had a face, and he wore a black frock coat. Silas Croft. Croft was a man who looked like he belonged in a San Francisco bank, not the Arizona dust. He owned the saloon in Pinnacle Creek and, rumor had it, the marshal as well. He was buying up all the failed homesteads in the valley, consolidating his power. He'd ridden up to Hawk's Rest a week ago, his 2 hired regulators, a brutish man named Reno and a quiet, watchful one called Dutch, flanking him. He'd taken off his hat, his smile as smooth as an undertaker's. "Mrs. Hayes, a tragedy. What happened to your husband?" "It was," she had said, her rifle held casually in the crook of her arm. "This is no place for a woman of your delicacy. The land is unforgiving." "It's my land. For now." His eyes had flicked to her well, the one that still gave water while the creek below was dry. "I am prepared to offer you a fair price, enough to see you back to St. Louis in comfort. I'm not selling." Croft's smile had tightened. "This valley is going to be worth a great deal someday, Mrs. Hayes. A railroad is coming, and the railroad needs water. Your water. Do not be the stubborn rock that stands in the way of progress. The rock tends to get broken." He had gestured to the mountains, hazy and purple in the distance. "Victorio's band is restless. They say he's moving north. A fire, a stray bullet. Such a tragedy to befall a property without protection." She had leveled the Winchester at the center of his starched white shirt. "The only protection I need is right here, Mr. Croft. Get off my land." He had tipped his hat, the smile never wavering. "As you wish." As they'd ridden away, Reno had spat a stream of tobacco juice toward her porch. "Stubborn witch," he'd muttered. Now, a week later, the heat was a physical weight. The air was a shimmer. Her supplies were low. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the jerky was hard as wood. She was surviving on grit and the memory of Jonathan's promise. "We'll make this work, Windy. This land, it's our future." She was on her way back from the chicken coop, 2 small eggs in her basket, when she heard it. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a footstep. It was the sound of a small rock skittering down the side of the gully that ran along the east side of her property. She froze. Her hand went to the worn pistol on her hip. The hawks were silent. The air was still. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice raspy. Silence. She moved slowly, setting the basket down and gripping the pistol. She eased toward the edge of the gully, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape of greasewood and prickly pear. She saw nothing. She was about to turn back, blaming the heat for playing tricks on her, when she saw it. A smear of dark color on a pale, flat rock, dark red. Too dark for iron ore. Blood. Her heart hammered. She raised the pistol, her thumb pulling back the hammer with a small, sharp click. "Come out!" she ordered. "Show yourself, or I'll shoot." A pained, rasping breath answered her. From behind a large boulder, a figure tried to push itself up. It wasn't a man. It was a boy. He was perhaps 14 or 15, clad in torn buckskin leggings and a tattered cotton shirt that had once been white. His black hair was matted with sweat and blood. A beautifully beaded armband was half hidden on his bicep, woven with bright quills and 3 tiny hawk feathers. He was Apache. He looked at her, his eyes wide, not just with fear, but with a burning, defiant hatred. He tried to reach for a knife that wasn't there. Then his strength failed him, and he collapsed back into the dust. Windy's mind screamed, "Run! Go back to the cabin, bar the door, and wait for him to die." This was the enemy, the heathen viper, the reason her neighbors shunned her, the reason Reverend Gideon preached of fire and brimstone. If the town found him here, found her near him, they would ask no questions. They would drag her to Pinnell Creek and hang her from the nearest cottonwood as a traitor. She took a step back. The boy was dying. It was not her business. It was the land's business. But she didn't leave. She just stood there, the heavy pistol trembling in her hand. He was just a boy. He was thin, his ribs visible beneath the torn shirt, his face gaunt from fever and exhaustion. He was someone's son. She thought of Jonathan, bleeding out on that same dusty ground. She thought of her own screams for help and the empty silence that had answered her. "Damn it," she whispered. She cursed the land. She cursed Croft. She cursed God. And then she cursed herself, because she knew, with a sinking, terrible certainty, that she couldn't walk away. The part of her that was Windy Hayes, the woman who had come here to build a life, not just to survive, wouldn't let her. Lowering the pistol, she slid down the rocky incline. The boy flinched as her shadow fell over him, trying to push himself backward with his hands, a low growl in his throat. I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her voice unsteady. She holstered the pistol, holding her hands up and open. He just stared, his black eyes burning with fever. She saw the wound now. It was his side. A dark, ugly stain was spreading from a hole just above his hip. It was a bullet wound, and by the smell, a rancid, coppery stench that cut through the dry air. It was badly infected. His left leg was also twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone of his shin clearly broken and jutting against the skin. He was delirious, muttering in a language she didn't understand. Getting him back to the cabin was an agony for them both. He was light, but she was weak from sparse rations. She tried to lift him. He cried out, a sharp, animal sound of pain, and tried to fight her. "Be still! I'm trying to help you, you little fool!" she hissed, frustration and fear making her sharp. She finally managed to get her shoulder under his arm. She half dragged, half carried him, his broken leg dragging in the dirt. Every jolt sent a fresh wave of pain through him, and through her. Her own legs shook. She expected a bullet from the ridge at any second. Reno or Dutch, watching her. But no shot came. The valley was empty, indifferent. She hauled him up the porch steps and through the door, kicking it shut with her heel and throwing the heavy wooden bar. The cabin was swelteringly hot, the air thick with the smell of dust and her fear. She laid him on her own cot, the one piece of comfort she possessed. He was unconscious now, his body limp. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing heavily, the reality of her decision crashing down on her. "What have I done? What have I done, Jonathan?" she whispered to the empty room. The photograph on the mantel offered no answer. She shook herself. There was no time for panic. If she was going to do this, she had to do it. She was no longer just a widow, no longer a homesteader. She was the woman she had been before, the woman who had nursed her own mother through the consumption. She boiled water from her precious, rationed supply. She tore strips from her one good linen sheet, the one she'd been saving. She found the last of Jonathan's medicinal whiskey, a half-full bottle she'd kept but never touched. She cut away the torn, filthy shirt. The wound was worse than she'd thought. It was puckered, an angry purple and green, leaking a thin, foul-smelling fluid. The bullet had gone clean through, but it had left a legacy of poison. Her hands, surprisingly, were steady. She cleaned the entry and exit wounds with the scalding water, her touch as gentle as she could make it. The boy screamed in his delirium, a high, thin sound that cut her to the bone. "Hush, child, hush," she murmured, the words automatic, the same ones she'd used on a frightened colt. Then came the hard part. She uncorked the whiskey. "Lord, forgive me for this," she breathed. She poured the raw spirits straight into the open wound. The boy's body arched off the cot, a strangled, inhuman shriek tearing from his throat. He went rigid, his back bowed, and then collapsed, his body shuddering. But the fever glaze in his eyes seemed to break for a second, replaced by a look of such profound, agonizing shock that she had to look away. Then she tackled the leg. It was a bad break, the bone sharp. She found 2 flat boards from a broken crate, padding them with more of the precious linen. Gritting her own teeth, she took a deep breath, grabbed his ankle and knee, and pulled. He screamed again, but it was weaker this time. There was a wet, sickening thunk as the bone ends grated and settled. Windy worked fast, her face slick with sweat, binding the boards tightly, immobilizing the leg. By the time the sun began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, she was done. The cabin smelled of whiskey, blood, and infection. The boy was breathing, shallowly, his body slick with a fever she wasn't sure he could survive. She slumped into the chair Jonathan had built, the rifle across her lap, and watched the shadows fill the corners of the room. She had just invited the war into her home. She looked at the armband she had removed to clean him. It was lying on her table. The 3 hawk feathers. It reminded her of the hawks that nested on the cliffs. She knew enough from town gossip. She was holding a token of the Warm Springs Apache, the people of Victorio. She was harboring the son of a man the U.S. government considered a monster. And she had just 3 days' worth of water left in her barrel. The night was an eternity. Windy didn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair, Jonathan's chair, her Winchester across her lap. Every scrape of a branch against the roof, every distant howl of a coyote sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She was a prisoner in her own home, trapped by the unconscious boy on her cot. He burned with fever. He tossed, his legs kicking, his splintered one thudding dully against the wall. He cried out, not in English, not in Spanish, but in the sharp, guttural clicks and flowing vowels of the Apache tongue. He spoke to people who were not there. He spoke to the shadows. And then, in a moment of terrible clarity, he said a name she understood. Victorio, he said, the name a sharp, clear plea. Shana. Windy's blood ran cold. Shana. Father. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. She was hiding Victorio's son, the son of the most feared, most hated man in the Arizona Territory. She felt a wave of nausea, of pure, undiluted terror. If Croft had even an inkling. She pushed herself up and went to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. The moon was high, bathing the valley in a ghostly, silver light. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. It felt like the whole world was watching her, holding its breath. She looked back at the boy. He was just a child. His face, relaxed in his fever sleep, was smooth. He had a strong jaw, his father's jaw, she imagined. But his mouth was soft. He was the enemy who had murdered her neighbors, the savage of Reverend Gideon's sermons. But he was also a son, calling for his father. Her fear battled with a strange, fierce, new emotion. It wasn't pity. It was a cold, hard defiance. The world, Croft, the town, the land itself, had tried to break her. It had taken Jonathan. It would not have this boy. Saving him was no longer just an act of mercy. It was an act of rebellion. She spent the long hours of the first day in a grim routine. She forced water, drop by drop, between his cracked lips from her dwindling supply. She boiled a handful of dried herbs from her garden, sage and thyme, and made a thin, bitter tea, which she used to wipe the sweat from his brow. She thought of Jonathan. She had tended to him in those same frantic hours after the raid. He hadn't died instantly. He'd lingered until sunset. She'd held his hand, whispering promises she couldn't keep, telling him the doctor was coming, telling him he would be fine. He'd looked at her, his eyes already distant, and whispered one word: run. She hadn't run then, and she wouldn't run now. Late in the afternoon, A new sound came. A horse. Windy's heart leapt into her throat. She ran to the door, peering through the spy hole Jonathan had drilled. It wasn't Croft. It was a lone rider, a grizzled old prospector known in Pinnell Creek as Old Man Hemlock. He was a harmless eccentric, his mule laden with picks and pans. He was riding toward her well. Windy panicked. She grabbed the bloody rags, the whiskey bottle and the bowl, and shoved them under the cot. She threw her thickest quilt over the boy, covering him completely. "Don't make a sound," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Do you understand?" No sound. The boy was too deep in his fever to respond. Hemlock reached the well and squinted down it. He looked toward the cabin. "Mrs. Hayes, you in there?" Windy unbarred the door and stepped onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind her. She forced her hands to stop shaking. "Afternoon, Mr. Hemlock." "Afternoon. Well's looking mighty low, ma'am. Almost dry." Windy's stomach tightened. The well wasn't low, not yet, but she'd been drawing from it heavily. "It's the drought," she lied, her voice tight. "Barely enough for myself." Hemlock stroked his beard, his eyes lingering on her cabin. "Strange times. The whole territory's riled up. They say Victorio's band hit the Sanderson ranch down south. Killed 'em all, even the children." Windy felt the blood drain from her face. "Army's called up the scouts. They're sweeping the hills," Hemlock continued, oblivious to her terror. "Word is, a brave got separated from the war party. Wounded. They're hunting him." He nodded toward her door. "You ought to be careful, ma'am. A woman alone. Tain't safe. Tain't safe at all. You got extra water. You ought to share, but, well, if it's low, it's low." He tugged on his mule's lead. "Keep that rifle loaded." "I always do, Mr. Hemlock." She watched him amble away, his words echoing in the hot, still air. Wounded. They're hunting him. She stumbled back inside, barring the door. She was shaking so violently she had to sit down. She hadn't just saved a boy. She had hidden a fugitive, a murderer, the killer of the Sandersons. She looked at the lump on the cot. The quilt was soaked in his sweat. She pulled it back. The boy was staring at her. His eyes were no longer glazed. The fever had broken. They were lucid, black, and filled with an intelligent, watchful fear. He had heard. He had understood. The second day dawned with a new, terrifying silence. The fever was gone, but the boy, Taza, he had finally murmured, his voice a dry rasp, was weak. The lucidity brought a new tension. He was no longer a patient. He was a prisoner, and she was his jailer. They existed in a strange, silent truce. She brought him broth, made from her last 2 eggs and some dried corn. He watched her every move, his hand never far from the splint on his leg, as if he might use it as a weapon. Words were almost useless, but they found a way. She pointed to herself. Windy. He watched her, his gaze intense. He was proud, she could see that. Wounded, but not broken. After a long moment, he pointed to his own chest. "Taza." "Taza," she repeated. He nodded, once. He looked at the photograph of Jonathan on the mantel. He pointed. "My husband," Windy said, her hand going to her heart. "Jonathan. He is gone." She made a motion of flying away, of the soul leaving. Taza understood. Gone. He looked at her, and his expression softened, just for an instant. He pointed out the window, toward the distant, hazy peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. "Victorio. Shah Na, father." A cold, heavy understanding passed between them. He had just confirmed her worst fear, and in doing so, had trusted her with his life. He was the son of the great chief, and he was telling her, his captor. He was testing her. She simply nodded. "You are safe, here." She pointed to the floor. Safe. He didn't look like he believed her. He looked like a wolf in a trap, biding his time. She was outside, checking the perimeter for the 10th time, when the knock came. It wasn't a knock. It was the hard, solid thud of a rifle butt against her door. Thud, thud, thud. Taza's eyes snapped wide. He tried to sit up, his face a mask of pain and adrenaline, his hand searching for a knife that wasn't there. Windy ran inside, her heart leaping into her throat. "Get down!" she hissed. She threw the heavy quilt over him, the same one from yesterday. "Don't move. Don't breathe. No matter what you hear. No matter what." She grabbed her rifle, moving silently to the door. "Who is it?" "Just paying a social call, Mrs. Hayes." Silas Croft's voice was honey smooth, but it couldn't hide the venom. "Open the door. We have business." Windy looked back at the cot. Taza was rigid, a still, unnatural lump under the quilt. She took a deep breath, unbarred the door, and opened it just a crack, the rifle held low, out of sight but ready. Silas Croft stood on her porch, flanked by Reno and Dutch. Croft was, as always, immaculate in a black frock coat, a stark contrast to the grime of the land. Reno was grinning, tobacco juice staining his beard. Dutch was behind him, his face impassive, his eyes scanning everything. "A bit jumpy, are we?" Croft smiled, and with a push that was almost gentle, he forced the door open. Windy had to step back or be knocked over. The three men filled her small cabin, their bulk and the smell of whiskey and sweat sucking the air out of the room. "This is my home, Croft. You're not welcome here." Tsk, tsk. Such hostility. Croft's eyes did a slow, methodical sweep. The single chair, the empty fireplace, the table, the cot. Windy's blood ran cold. She had cleaned up, but had she been thorough enough? Had she missed a drop of blood? "Just wanted to give you a final warning," Croft said, walking the perimeter of the room. He picked up the photograph of Jonathan. "That Sanderson raid. Terrible business. The whole town is on edge. The cavalry is out, but they're never where you need them, are they? What's that got to do with me?" Windy kept her voice flat, her body tensed, positioning herself between Croft and the cot. "Well," Croft said, setting the photo down. "Old man Hemlock passed through town. Said you were acting. Strange. Said your well was low. We both know that spring's the deepest in the valley, Windy." He used her first name, and it felt like a violation. He sniffed the air. "What's that smell? Smells like sickness. And whiskey?" Reno chuckled. "Maybe she's taken to the bottle, boss. Grieving." "Maybe." Croft's eyes fixed on the cot. "What's that on the bed, Mrs. Hayes? Your laundry? It's 100 degrees in here, and you've got your winter quilt out." He took a step toward it. Windy raised the rifle, the movement fluid and desperate. She cocked the hammer. The click was deafeningly loud in the small space. "Stop." Dutch and Reno drew their pistols in a single, fluid motion, their muzzles trained on her chest. The cabin was silent. The only sound was the buzzing of a fly near the window, and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of Taza's breathing under the heavy quilt. "I said," Windy repeated, her voice shaking but her aim true, centered on Croft's pristine white shirt. "Get out." Croft looked at the muzzle of the rifle. He looked at her eyes. He saw no bluff there. He saw only the raw, desperate edge of a woman with nothing left to lose. He raised his hand slowly, that awful smile returning. "My apologies. I've overstepped." As he turned, his heel scraped the floor. At the same time, Dutch, who was standing near the cot, shifted his own boot. Windy saw it, a dark, reddish-brown smear on the floorboards, one she had missed. Dutch's boot, heavy and dusty, had deliberately, almost casually, scuffed over it, hiding it in the grime. He met Windy's eyes for one, baffling second. His expression was blank. "A man can't be too careful," Croft was saying from the porch. "We'll be going." He backed out slowly, Dutch and Reno following. "But I'm telling you, Windy," Croft said, his voice losing its polish, his eyes as cold as a snake's. "If I find out you're harboring that filth, that wounded brave they're all hunting, I'll burn this place to the ground with you in it. And the good people of Pinnell Creek, including Reverend Gideon, will call it God's justice." He turned and mounted his horse. The three of them rode off, not fast, but with a terrible, deliberate confidence. Windy slammed the bar back across the door, her knees giving way. She slid to the floor, the rifle clattering beside her. She was shaking so violently she couldn't breathe. The quilt on the cot moved. Taza pushed it off, his face pale and slick with sweat, but his eyes were blazing. He had heard it all. He had seen the standoff. He looked at her, and for the first time, the defiance was gone. The hatred was gone. His expression was something new. It was a shared, terrible understanding. And it was respect. The third day arrived with the oppressive, suffocating promise of a thunderstorm that would never come. The air was yellow with dust. The confrontation with Croft had changed everything. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb. A new, desperate problem had arisen. Taza's wound. Despite her cleaning, the infection was back, and it was angrier than before. The flesh around the bullet hole was hot to the touch, and a thin red line was beginning to creep up his side. The fever was returning. Windy knew, with a sickening certainty, that her boiled water and whiskey weren't enough. He needed real medicine. She remembered Jonathan pointing out a plant on one of their first walks. "The Mexicans call it chaparral," he'd said. "The settlers call it greasewood. They say the Apache make a poultice from it. Cures all, they claim." She had to get it. It grew thick in the gully where she'd found Taza. "I'll be back," she told him, her voice low. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." He watched her, his eyes clouded with returning fever. He nodded, his hand gripping the edge of the cot. She took her pistol, leaving the rifle, and slipped out the back window, not daring to unbar the door. She moved in a low crouch, her eyes on the ridge. She saw no one. She found the plant, its sticky, pungent leaves unmistakable. She gathered an armful, her hands shaking, her mind racing. She was a thief, stealing medicine for an Apache, while the man who wanted her land was planning to murder her. The irony was as bitter as the plant's smell. As she started to climb back up the small incline toward the cabin, she heard them. Wagon wheels. Men's voices. She froze, dropping flat behind a cluster of prickly pear. Her heart stopped. It was Croft. He wasn't at her cabin. He was at her well. He had his wagon, and with him were Reno, Dutch, and 4 other men from Pinnell Creek. They had shovels and picks. Windy watched in cold, helpless horror. "Fill it in, boys." Croft's voice was jovial, carrying clearly in the still air. "The marshal has declared this spring a public hazard. Contaminated, according to the writ." Reno laughed. "Contaminated with what, boss?" "With stubbornness," Croft said. He gestured to the mesa. "A shame. This whole valley needs water, and this one spring is poisoning the well for all of us, so to speak. Fill it up, all the way." The men set to work with a brutal efficiency. They shoveled rocks, dirt, and then, to Windy's horror, Reno slit open a sack of quicklime and dumped it down the hole. They were not just filling her well, they were poisoning it, destroying it. It was her only source of water. Without it, she couldn't last a week. It was a death sentence, delivered with a shovel and a smile. Dutch, she noticed, was not shoveling. He was standing by the wagon, his back to the others, looking up at the ridge. He was looking right at the cliffs where the hawks nested. He didn't turn, didn't look toward her. Windy lay in the dirt, the greasewood clutched in her hand, and wept silent, furious tears. This was it. This was the end. He'd won. When they were finished, the well was nothing but a raw scar of new-turned earth and white dust. Croft's men got in the wagon. "She'll come to us now, boss," Reno said, grinning. "Oh, she'll come," Croft said. "Or we'll come for her." They drove off, leaving a cloud of dust that settled over her broken land. Windy waited until they were gone. She crawled, defeated, back to the cabin. She slipped in through the window. Taza saw her face. He saw the dirt, the tears, the absolute despair. He looked at the half-empty water barrel in the corner. He looked at her. He understood. She didn't speak. She took the last of her drinking water, poured it into her smallest pot, and set it to boil. She crushed the chaparral leaves and made the poultice. She dressed his wound, the dark, steaming paste smelling of tar and desperation. Taza bore the pain without flinching. His eyes never left her face. He knew. His presence was killing her. That night, the night of the third day, the air in the cabin was thick with the smell of the poultice and the metallic tang of fear. Windy fell into a fitful doze in her chair, exhausted by the terror and the heat. She woke with a jolt, a sudden, piercing sense of wrongness. The cabin was too quiet. She looked at the cot. It was empty. Taza? She scrambled to the door. The bar was still in place. She ran to the back window. The shutter was ajar. The leather thong that held it fast had been cut. "No, no, no, you fool boy," she whispered, fumbling with the bar. She tore the door open and ran onto the patch of dirt that had been her porch. The pre-dawn light was a cold, grey wash. She saw the trail he'd left in the dust, the agonizing drag marks of his splintered leg and his hands. He had crawled out, taking nothing. He was heading for the gully, back the way he'd come. "Taza!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Get back here! You won't last a day, they'll find you!" She ran, grabbing her rifle as she went, stumbling over the rocky, uneven ground. She followed his trail, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She found him at the bottom of the gully, collapsed against the same boulder where she had first found him. He had made it maybe 200 yards. His leg was bleeding again, the bandages dark. He was panting, his body slick with sweat. She grabbed him, her anger born of sheer terror. "What were you thinking? You're throwing your life away. You're throwing my life away." He pushed her arm off, his face a mask of pain and grim resolve. He pointed back at her cabin, then at the poisoned, filled-in well. He pointed at her, then he pointed at himself and drew a shaking finger across his throat. His message was clear. "I am your death. Let me go. It is my time." "No," she said, shaking her head, tears of frustration blurring her vision. I didn't." She stopped. What was she doing? Saving him only to watch Croft destroy her, letting him go only to know he would die in the desert? As they stared at each other, a new sound reached them, a sound that made them both freeze. Hoofbeats. But this was not the lazy, confident approach of Croft's men. This was the rhythmic, pounding cadence of many horses, moving fast, moving together. "Cavalry," Windy breathed. She grabbed Taza, dragging him deeper into the greasewood, behind the boulder. "Quiet, not a sound." They peered over the rocks. A patrol. A full dozen men in blue, their carbines rattling, their faces grim, their horses lathered. They were riding hard, following a trail, heading south, parallel to the gully. They were on a mission. They thundered past the base of Windy's Mesa, without a single glance up. The hunt was on. Victorio's raid had stirred the entire nest. When the dust settled, Windy looked at Tarsa. The decision was made. He couldn't stay. He couldn't go alone. And the cavalry was heading south, away from the path to the high mountains. "The mountains," she said, pointing north to the high peaks. "Victorio, Shana. Can you make it?" Tarsa looked at his leg. He looked at her. He nodded, once. A lie, but a brave one. "Not like that," she said. She ran back to the cabin. Her mind was clear, sharp, and cold. She didn't bother with the door. She grabbed her canteen and filled it with the last of the water from the barrel. She grabbed her satchel and filled it with the last of the jerky and a handful of cornmeal. She tore the rest of her linen sheet into proper bandages. She returned to the gully. She gave him the canteen and the food. She redressed his leg, pulling the bindings tight over the dark poultice. "Go," she said, pushing the satchel into his hands. "Stay in the gullies. Don't travel in the day. Follow the water." "No." She stopped. The creeks were dry. "Follow the hawks. They know where the water is. Go." "Now." He looked at her, his face unreadable in the grey light. He reached up and, with a pained grunt, worked the beaded armband from his bicep. He pressed it into her hand. "No, I can't." He closed her fingers around it, his own small hand surprisingly strong. His eyes were fierce. It was not a gift. It was a token, a marker for a debt. He said one word, a word she'd heard the settlers use, a greeting. "Dagote." It meant, "I am here. It is good." From him, it felt like a promise. Then, using her rifle as a crutch, Tarsa pulled himself up. He took one step, then another, his splintered leg a dead weight. He began the agonizing, limping, crawling journey up the gully, toward the cover of the high rocks, heading north. Windy watched until he was a speck, and then nothing. She was alone again. Truly alone. Her well was gone, her food was gone, and the token in her hand felt as heavy as a death warrant. She walked back to her cabin, barred the door, and waited for the end. The end came, as she knew it would, with the setting sun. She had spent the day in a daze, sitting in Jonathan's chair, the empty cabin her coffin. She watched the light change through the cracks in her shutters. The hawks had returned, circling high above. She envied them. Then, the dust cloud. This time it was not a patrol. It was not 3 men. It was a posse. Silas Croft rode at its head, but he was not alone. Behind him were Reno and Dutch, and at least 15 other men from Pinnell Creek. She recognized them. The blacksmith, the store owner, even Reverend Gideon, his face pale and set, holding a heavy Bible as if it were a weapon. They carried rifles, shotguns, and, to her horror, torches. They didn't stop at the well. They rode right up to her cabin, fanning out, forming a grim, silent crescent. They were a mob, their faces twisted with a self-righteous fury that was more terrifying than simple greed. "Windy Hayes!" Croft's voice boomed, shedding all pretense of civility. He held up a piece of paper. "You have been tried and found wanting. You are accused by the good people of Pinnell Creek of treason, of harboring and aiding the Apache murderer who butchered the Sanderson family." "That's a lie, Croft!" Windy shouted back, her voice shaking. "You know it." "We know what we know," yelled the blacksmith. "We know you've been trading with them. That's why they ain't never touched your place." "My husband was killed," she screamed, the injustice of it choking her. "By your red-skin friends to cover your tracks," Croft shouted, his performance masterful. "Reverend, say the words." Reverend Gideon urged his horse forward, his eyes closed. "The Lord says, 'Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live.'" This woman has turned her back on her own kind, on her own God. Her property is forfeit. Her soul is damned. You have one chance, Windy, Croft called. Come out and we'll take you to Pinnell Creek for a proper hanging. Go to hell, Silas. Croft's face darkened. I had hoped you'd be reasonable. He nodded to Reno. Reno, his face alight with a terrible, ecstatic joy, lit the torch he was carrying from a lantern. Burn the nest, boys. Burn the witch out. He rode forward and threw the torch onto the dry timbers of her small porch. The wood, seasoned by a year of unrelenting drought, went up like paper. Flames licked up the side of the cabin, smoke pouring through the gaps in the logs. Windy backed away from the door, coughing. The heat was immediate, intense. The cabin was a tinderbox. She ran to the back window, but 2 men were already there, their shotguns leveled. She was trapped. Come on out, Mrs. Hayes, Croft called, his voice laced with triumph. Face your justice. The smoke was thick, black and acrid. It burned her lungs. She could hear the wood crackling and popping, a hungry, living sound. Her eyes streamed. She fell to her knees, crawling to the center of the room where the air was clearest. She huddled by the cold fireplace, clutching Jonathan's photograph. This was it. Baked alive in her own home, for an act of kindness. The irony was as bitter as the smoke. She heard a crash as the porch roof gave way. The front door was now a solid wall of fire. God help me, Jonathan, she whispered, her voice lost in the roaring flames. And then, above the roar, she heard a new sound. It was a sound she had only heard from a distance, a sound that haunted the settlers' dreams. It was a high, ululating cry, a sound that seemed to pull the blood from your veins. It was not one voice, it was dozens. The yelling outside stopped. The triumphant jeers of the mob were replaced by a sudden, shocked silence. Then, a new voice, a single gunshot, a scream of pain. Apache! A man shrieked. It's an ambush! It's Victorio! God save us, it's Victorio! Windy, on her hands and knees, crawled to the side window. The smoke was so thick she could barely see. She wiped a clear patch on the grimy glass. What she saw made her heart stop. The ridge. The ridge behind her cabin, the one Jonathan had named Hawk's Rest, was lined with them. They were not a mob. They were a force of nature. Dozens of warriors, silhouetted against the dying red sun, sat on their horses, as still as the stone they occupied, silent, watching. And at their center was a tall man, his profile unmistakable, his hair long, Victorio. Beside him, on a smaller pony, was Taza. He was alive. He was pointing at her cabin, pointing at Croft. He hadn't gotten far. His father's scouting party, drawn by the cavalry's movement, had found him. And he had led them back. The mob from Pinnell Creek dissolved. These were not brave men. Faced with the reality of the warriors they claimed to hate, they broke. Men screamed, turned their horses, and fled, disappearing into the twilight as fast as they could. Reverend Gideon, his Bible dropped in the dust, was among the first to flee. In seconds the yard was empty, save for 3 men. Silas Croft, Reno, and Dutch. They were surrounded, trapped between the burning cabin and the silent line of warriors now descending the ridge, moving like a river of shadow. The Apache warriors didn't make a sound. They formed a wide, perfect circle around the 3 men, their bows drawn, their lances glinting in the firelight. Victorio rode his horse forward. He dismounted. He was taller than Windy had imagined, a man of terrifying presence. He looked not at Croft, but at the burning cabin. He saw the fire, the smoke, the trapped woman. He barked an order. Instantly, a dozen warriors dismounted, but not to fight. They ran to the horse trough, the one Windy had been rationing water into. They grabbed her empty buckets. They used their own blankets, soaking them from the trough and beating at the flames on the cabin wall. They worked with a practiced, terrifying efficiency. Croft, his face white with a terror he could no longer hide, raised his pistol. "Get back, you savages! This is white man's law!" He never finished the sentence. An arrow, fired by Taza from the ridge, embedded itself in the wooden stock of Croft's pistol, the force of it tearing the gun from his hand. Reno and Dutch threw their own guns to the ground, raising their hands. Dutch, Windy noted, did not look terrified. He looked resigned. Victoria walked past them, ignoring them as if they were insects. He came to the side window where Windy was watching, her face pressed to the glass. The smoke was clearing as his men worked. He looked at her. Just looked. Windy, her hand shaking, held up the beaded armband Taza had given her. Victoria saw it. His expression, which had been as hard as granite, softened, just for a fraction of a second. He recognized it. Taza had ridden down and was now beside his father, his splintered leg propped up. He spoke, his voice rapid and sharp, pointing at Croft, then at the filled-in well, then at the burning porch. He was telling the story. When he was finished, Victoria turned his gaze to Silas Croft. He said nothing. He didn't have to. He simply looked at the man who had tried to murder his son and who had tried to murder the woman who saved him. He gave a slight nod. Two warriors grabbed Croft and Reno. They didn't kill them. They didn't scalp them. They did something worse. They broke their rifles. They snapped their pistols. And they took their horses. They grabbed Dutch. He didn't struggle. Victoria looked at him. And Dutch. He simply nodded toward Windy's cabin. Taza said something, a single word, and pointed at the floor inside the cabin. He was telling his father about the boot, about the hidden blood. Victoria looked at Dutch for a long moment. Then he barked an order. The warriors knocked Dutch unconscious with a rifle butt and left him lying in the dirt. A mercy. Victoria pointed east, toward the barren, waterless desert that stretched for 100 miles. Walk. It was a sentence of death, but a slow one delivered by the land itself. Croft, sputtering and weeping, was shoved into the darkness, his man Reno forced after him. They would not survive the night. The fire was out. The cabin was scarred, the porch gone, but it was standing. Victoria turned back to Windy. She had managed to unbar the scorched door and stumble out, coughing. She stood before the great chief, a lone woman in a singed dress, her face black with soot, the armband clutched in her hand. They looked at each other for a long, silent moment. The war between their peoples, the hatred, the blood, it all hung in the air. Victoria reached into a pouch at his side. He pulled out a small, intricately carved turquoise stone, a hawk, its wings spread. He pressed it into her hand, closing her fingers around it, just as Taza had done. He said one word, in rough, halting English. Debt. He then gestured to the well. Two of his men, with the picks Croft had left, were already at work, digging out the rocks and the lime. He turned, mounted his horse, and with Taza beside him, led his warriors back up the ridge. Taza looked back, once, and raised his hand. Windy Hayes stood alone in the ruins of her yard, the turquoise warm in her palm. The Apache warriors vanished as silently as they had come. She was safe. She was alive. The debt was paid. Windy Hayes rebuilt her porch. The scar of the fire remained on the cabin wall, but so did she. Silas Croft and his man Reno were never seen again. Swallowed by the desert they tried to weaponize. Her well, cleaned and restored by the Apache, once again gave sweet water. The town of Pinnell Creek left her alone. The whispers didn't stop. But they changed. She was no longer just the widow. She was the woman who is protected, a figure of awe and of fear. Her story became a quiet legend, a reminder that in the unforgiving West, hatred was a fire that consumed everything. But a single act of courage, of humanity, could build a bridge. It proved that honor wasn't about the color of your skin, but the strength of your heart. If you were moved by this story of survival and honor, please like this video and share it with someone who appreciates true tales of the Wild West. And for more stories of forgotten history and incredible courage, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell. Thank you for listening.